You may remember earlier in the week, we talked about the tribunal, the rental tribunal, the housing tribunal here in Quebec that came out with that 5.9% number. That's the number landlords could increase your rent, and a lot of people are reacting very negatively to that today. Now, we wanted to get a bit more. We talked about this at the time. Didn't hear a lot from the housing minister, by the way, provincially as far as this goes. But yes, a lot of people are affected. That's a pretty big number. Let's say you're one of those people. What can you do? Richard Goldman is a lawyer, plain language specialist translator with Educaloi, and he is on the line. Richard, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
Let me begin with that. So you're a tenant. You're suddenly finding out that this is not even, by the way, disputable. This is what the recommendation is from the Housing Tribunal, which means you could be asked for considerably, I would guess, or to some degree, more than even that. What do you do as a tenant?
Okay, well, you're right that the sky is the limit in terms of what landlords can ask, but tenants do have a lot of protections in Quebec, including the right to refuse rent increases requested by the landlord and to rent control. Because if a tenant refuses, then the landlord and wants to stay in their apartment, then the landlord must apply to the Tribunal Administratif de Logement, what we usually call the rental board in English. The landlord must apply to the rental board, and then the rental board will set the rent. And you're right that the increases recommended, I shouldn't say recommend, the estimated by the tribunal this year are quite high. If we take, for example, an unheated apartment, the estimated increase last year was 4%. This year it's 5.9%. If we take a unit heated by the landlord by oil, last year it was 1.6%. This year it's 4.1%. So anywhere from about 50% higher to double last year. It's a very big increase, and as you mentioned, a lot of people will be impacted. Now, if a tenant does refuse and says that they want to stay in their apartment, and the landlord does apply to the tribunal to set the rent, what we have seen in recent years is those estimates generally hold. So if you're in an unheated apartment and your landlord asks you for 5.9% and you refuse and it goes to the rental board, you'll probably get about that amount of increase.
So you get the 5.9%, but as we said off the top, chances are it's going to be more than 5.9%. I just want you, Richard, if you can, because too many times we hear about tenants who decide, oh, it's going to be too problematic to fight this. It's better to say nothing and just stay because it's hard to find an apartment to begin with. What's the recommendation here if it's, say, 7, 8, 9, 10%?
Well, once again, these estimates by the rental board are historically quite accurate in terms of what you will get if the case goes before the tribunal. So it's an important guideline both for landlords and for tenants. So I gave the example, if you get an increase that's about what the rental board is estimating, you're probably going to get that if the case goes to the rental board. But that also means that if your landlord asks for 10 or 20%, because they have the right to ask whatever they want, if your landlord asks for much more than the estimate of the rental board, you know that if you refuse, you're going to get a lot less. You're very likely to get a lot less at the rental board because they historically follow, the decisions historically follow the estimate.
So let me stop you and then say, what's the procedure then if you're going to do that? Let's say it is, in fact, as you just said, 20%. That's what your landlord comes back with. At that point, you decide, no, you're not going to pay that. You want to begin the process. What do you do? And how much time do you have to do it?
Okay. So how much time? 30 days. What you have to do is extremely simple. One thing that maybe tenants don't realize or understand is that once you send a letter saying, I refuse the increase, but I want to stay in my apartment, the ball is entirely in the landlord's court. They must file the case with the tribunal. They must prepare all the documentation for the tribunal, all the proof of the increase in their costs, their energy costs, their tax bill, etc. And all the tenant has to do is show up at the hearing, which actually is now taking quite long, many months, but show up at the hearing, hear what the landlord has to say. The commissioner from the rental board will go over all the landlord's documents to make sure everything is legit and will rule on the case. So the tenant has to do no more than send a registered letter saying, I refuse the increase, but I want to stay in my apartment.
Is it about a registered letter? Can you do this in any way? I know you need to show proof that it was received by the landlord.
You do need to show proof. So registered letter is generally the safest. If, for example, you're in a larger building with a rental office and you go in with the refusal and 2 copies and they sign or stamp your copy as a receipt, that's perfectly good too.
Okay. In the interim, between the time you file this, if you're a tenant and decide to dispute the rent increase, and the time it ends up at the board, you're saying we're talking about months, and I imagine with numbers like these, it might take even longer. You're still paying the old rent, right?
That's correct.
Until such time as there is a ruling. But then, of course, the issue with that is if there is a ruling in the landlord's favor, you're then paying, well, I guess retroactively, all the rent you had not paid up until that time.
Yes, that is an issue, and it can be a hardship. So let's take a person whose rent is $1,000 and who ends up with a 6% increase 10 months later. Well, that's $60 times 10 months that they have to pay in one shot, $600 they have to pay in one shot.
I would ask you with respect, because it seems to me the reaction to this one is, how did we go from, 4% last year to 5.9%? And the argument has been, interest rates have been falling now for roughly the past year or so. How does the tribunal, come up with this number?
Well, I'm not an expert on their calculation method. My understanding is that there's a lot of criticisms of their method, and it's lagged somewhat. So, it reflects costs from the past year. So if something has gone down, it won't be reflected for another year. So that would seem to be an issue, a certain lag in their calculation, which means that actually this may be reflecting economic conditions from a year ago. With interest rates dropping this year, perhaps the increases will be lower next year.
One last thing to ask, actually a couple of things. In this situation where, you're moving into a unit that's not been occupied, and then there's the issue of you don't know how much rent was charged to the last tenant. What can you do as a tenant to make sure you're not being gouged in that perspective? Well,
the landlord does have to provide the the lowest rent that was charged in the last 12 months. Even if it's been empty for a couple of months, they have to provide the lowest rent that has been charged in the last 12 months. And you as a tenant have the right to go to the rental board if you're being charged more than that, to have it set by the rental board. And the rental board will set these, will use these same criteria. So let's take an example. You move into apartment and that's been unoccupied for a few months. The landlord informs you that the previous rent was $800, but you're being asked to pay $1,000. You sign the lease. You can then go to the rental board. In this case, it's up to the tenant to go to the rental board. You can go to the rental board, ask the rental board to set the rent, and let's say you're getting a standard about 6% for an unheated apartment. Your rent will be $848, 6% increase over 800 instead of the 1,000. So tenants do have a lot of rights in this area, but you're right, as you mentioned before, a lot of tenants, especially new tenants, are very hesitant to exercise their rights for fear of being in conflict with the landlord.
Last question, though. In that particular case, so you've already signed that lease at $1,000, then you go to the rental board?
Yes. In the scenario that I just presented, you signed the lease at $1,000. You are informed by a section of the lease that the landlord must fill out that the previous rent was $800. You have 10 days to go to the rental board to have them set your rent according to the low percentage criteria that we just talked about.
I wonder how many people even know that. Richard, we have to leave it at that. I'm out of time. I thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Always a pleasure.